So Shabbat Shalom. Rick Landman told me before we started Shabbat services that it is the parsha of a jackass that talks. So, Rick, I'm saying that in your name. But I'm not talking about that this evening. Susan says it's a she-ass specifically. Okay, all right. So, but I'm not going to talk about that this evening, Rick. But I wanted to credit you with your. So instead, I want to talk about grief. A little bit different. I want to talk about grief because I've been thinking a lot about grief recently. And in particular, I've been thinking about all the different types of grief that exist and that we're all carrying within this room. And I'm just going to name a few, but there's more. So there's the grief that's associated with the loss of a loved one. And then there's grief that's associated with the loss of a role. If you've shifted jobs or career or life stages recently. There's grief that's disenfranchised grief that's harder to mourn out in the open, such as loss of a friendship or loss of a pet or a miscarriage. And then there's grief associated with mourning what you thought might come to pass but didn't, the life that you thought you might live. And then there's communal grief, which is grief over the state of the world. And in many ways, these griefs are all alike. It's grief over what we hoped the world, either our personal world or the world at large, might look like, and now it does not. I came across a poem by Fortessa Latifi that stopped me in my tracks just this past week, and it reads this. All my grief says the same thing. This isn't how it's supposed to be. This isn't how it's supposed to be. And the world laughs, holds my hope by the throat, says, but this is how it is. This isn't how it's supposed to be. That's the essence of grief. I would imagine that for many, this sense of communal, world-based grief has been even more activated recently. Trump rising in power, seemingly gaining even more popularity. Joe Biden looking older and more fragile than we would like him to. The Israeli government not seeing what is happening in Gaza as a wake-up call in valuing Palestinian lives. Israeli hostages still in captivity and families still ripped apart. This isn't how it's supposed to be. This isn't how it's supposed to be, right? But this is how it is. But this is how it is the essence of trying to figure out what do we do once we realize there's no other magic option, nobody is coming with a magic wand to wave it away and make something new or something different than what we like. This is where we are now, in the hopeless mess of the world, trying to figure out how we move forward from a place of grief and not get stuck in wishing the world could look different. I want to talk about two ways in which Judaism acknowledges grief. The first is communal, and the second is more personal. So first, the communal. Judaism actually has a place in the Jewish calendar for acknowledging grief, and we are about to enter it. On July 23rd, it will be Shabbat Tammuz, the 17th of Tammuz. It actually starts on the 22nd at night, but if you're observing the fast, you'll start on the 23rd because it's a sun-up to sundown fast. So Shabbat Tammuz begins July 22nd in the evening. And it begins a period that we call the 3 weeks. It begins with the first fast of the 17th of Tammuz, and it ends with the fast and the communal day of mourning of Tisha B'Av, the saddest day of the Jewish calendar. This 3-week period commemorates a 3-week period in Jewish history where historically many sad events have taken place. And it's known between these 3 weeks are known as Bein HaMetzarim, between the narrow, constricted places. So most notably what happens in this Bein HaMetzarim time in the Jewish calendar, in Jewish history, there's 2 major things. The Talmud lists 5, but I'm going to list the 2 major ones that have happened on the 17th of Tammuz. The first is Moshe breaking the tablets. So Moshe goes up the mountain, comes down, sees the Jews worshiping the golden calf, and shatters the tablets. And I know we've talked many times over the years about how actually Moshe shattering the tablets is the start of a different sort of cycle of Jewish time where Moses goes back up comes down with the second set of tablets, and that when Moshe comes down with the second set of tablets, that's actually Yom Kippur. So there's a way in which Shavas Arba Tammuz, which we're about to enter, really starts this very long sort of cycle towards the high holidays. And really, the high holidays for us doesn't end until Simchat Torah. We really think of the whole, all the holidays in Tishrei as the high holidays, which you might notice sort of also culminates right before the election. So we're sort of in this particular Jewish time that's also in some ways aligning with the secular time of Bein HaMetzarim, of constriction and fear. And the second thing that happens on Shavas Arba Tammuz is that during the Roman siege of Jerusalem, this is when it was thought that the city walls were breached, which leads to the destruction of the temple, which takes place on Tisha B'Av. So those are sort of some of the historical events that have happened around these 3-week time, both the breaking of the tablets and the breach of Jerusalem, which leads to the destruction of the temple. So you can see it's really a time to feel into the sadness and loss of a life we thought we knew. A loss of structures that were put into place and then crumbled. A loss of a sense of certain kind of identity, one based around home and place. A loss of the way that things used to be done. It's really a big communal loss in a very real way. So many Jews take on some mourning practices during this 3-week period, starting on the 17th of Tammuz. Jews typically don't get married during this time because we don't want it to be seen as a time of celebrating. Many don't listen to live music because that also would be considered too joyful. Some people don't cut their hair, and some people don't buy new clothing. My friend and colleague at the Park Slope Jewish Center in Park Slope, Haley Goldstein, Rabbi Haley Goldstein, recently wrote a grief booklet on this time in the Jewish calendar. And she says, this is a time of grief in our calendar where there are many prohibitions, but not many prescriptions. We are told to generally be with grief, but we're not given much instruction on how to do that. So she writes this booklet in order to encourage us this year in particular to see this cycle of Jewish time as a way to interact and engage with our grief a little bit more purposefully. And one of my very favorite things about Judaism is that it does not shy away from sadness or sorrow. They are important parts of being human. If we are meant to live fully on this earth, which I believe we are, then we are meant to experience heartbreak. And we are meant to experience loss and grief. We have to. Judaism acknowledges that sitting and throwing a small tantrum, saying, this is not how it's supposed to be, is part of the process. It's part of what can get us into the next phase, which is action, which is movement, which is creativity, which is hope. We can't move into that part where we can imagine a new future unless we fully allow ourselves to be sad for the past. So let me now talk about the personal way I've been dealing with this grief, which is through another Jewish mourning practice, reciting Psalm 23. Psalm 23 is often recited at funerals or shivas, and in fact, many of you are probably familiar with the way it's sort of chanted in English, with the opening line, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." So Psalm 23 has been a personal comfort psalm of mine for many, many, many years. And in fact, some of you might remember that for my installation Shabbat, I chose a line from Psalm 23 to put on the cover of the Shabbat program. I chose V'shavti b'veit Adonai la'orach yamim. I'll sit in God's house all the days of my life because it's my most fervent wish. And some of you might also remember that Rabbi Rapport spoke about me at my installation, and she said, wow, Yael, when I saw that you chose a line from Psalm 23 for your installation Shabbat, I thought, intense. And it is known as intense. Psalm 23 is known as sort of intense and maybe a little bit dark because it's associated with death. And that was also some of the imagery I had with it, but when I recently began saying it every day, I was surprised by how actually unintense it is. So the famous line, the line that's sort of associated with why it's read at funerals and at Shiva is, Gam ki elech begeit sal mavet, lo irara ki ata imadi. I walk through the valley of deepest darkness, but I won't be afraid because you are with me. And I was struck by what an apt metaphor this is for when we don't know where we're going, because around us feels uncertain or a mess, or because the unknown of the future has started to feel like too much to bear. That is the valley of deepest darkness. That is the valley of grief, and we've all been there at some point in our lives. So there's a midrash that I've come to associate with the 3 weeks, with the Bein HaMetzarim, this narrow, constricted place. And it comes from the book of Exodus, a midrash on the time in Egypt when God sends the plague of darkness. So all of Egypt is subsumed in darkness, and the text tells us that it's so dark that you couldn't even see if you put your hand in front of your face, your eyes would never acclimate to it. That's how dark it was. And except for the small patch of land that Israel is living on, they get like sort of a little bit of light. The midrash goes into exactly how they get their light, but suffice to say, it's not really very much light. Okay, so now we're not talking about metaphorical darkness, but literal darkness. And in some ways, this feels like an even more apt metaphor for how it feels to walk around clouded by sadness, because you can see a little bit, but you can't really fully move around like that. So here's the midrash. The midrash says, in this place, during the plague of darkness, God comes to the Israelites and holds out a cup of wine and says, please accept this cup of wine as a cup of consolation, as a cup of, I'm asking for your forgiveness for the hardship that you're going through. And they say back to God, Master of the universe, first you get angry with us, and you take us from our home and exile us to live among the nations, and we are like a discarded vessel among them. And now you come with this cup of wine to ask us for forgiveness, to appease us? And God understands and responds, my children, from the day that I destroyed my house below, I have not gone up and sat in my house above. Rather, I have sat near you in the dew and in the rain. And if you don't believe me, feel my head, put your hands on my head, and see that there is dew there. Because, as we know, it's written in the Song of Songs, my head is soaked with dew and my curls with night rain. So this is a beautiful picture of God, a picture of a God who is with us in our grief. A God who is not merely watching the mess that we're in, the mess down on earth, and distancing themselves from it, but God who is sitting with us. A God who has been continually sitting with us this whole time, in our pain and in our confusion. Now, the hard part is believing that, right? It's so easy to feel abandoned. But this midrash paints a picture of God saying, no, I am right here. I am with you. And this is where I believe the rituals of Judaism come in. Something terrible happens beyond what is in our capacity to deal with. And we have to sit and really allow ourselves to be in the grief space, to take the 3 weeks, to allow ourselves to be upset. And then we have to challenge ourselves to imagine God holding out for us this cup of consolation, or the small little bit of light. God with dew shining on God's head saying, okay, it's time to get up now. It's time to move toward the next part of your story, the part where you survive. The end of Psalm 23 says, Ach tov v'chesed yirdefuni kol yamei chayai. Goodness and mercy will be with me all the days of my life, will pursue me all the days of my life. Because, hopefully, good and grief go hand in hand. Yes, it's important to feel sad, but we must also allow ourselves to be open to the good. And if I can say one last thing about these next 3 weeks as a time of mourning and a little bit of narrowness, it's also that it cannot be done alone. There's the personal way we must all move through our own pain and hardships. But the ritual of being in the constricted place together reminds us that grief is also better when it's shared, when it's communal. This is not how it's supposed to be, but this is how it is. So now how are we going to walk through it together? Shabbat shalom.